Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Bruce Bennett. Now, Bruce is a senior researcher at the RAND Corporation's International Security and Defense Policy Center. And beyond focusing a lot of his research on asymmetrical threats, counterproliferation, and defense strategy, he has also recently produced a significant amount of work on the issue of Korean reunification, specifically the pathways to reunification and the challenges thereof. This is one of those areas of study that people instinctively think they understand. It's a catchphrase in many ways. The term reunification runs off the tongue, and very rarely do people stop and consider just what it means, just how hard it will be, or if it will even be possible. And if possible, just how it will come about in the first place. Throughout the years, there has not been a South Korean president that has not been committed to this issue. They have taken different emphases and promoted different policies for achieving this, but it has always been central to South Korean politics and to South Korean identity. Similarly in the North, Kim Il-sung down to Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un have made this a central tenet of their policy and of the legitimation of their regime. When Kim Jong-un speaks of the final victory, and when terms like this rattle through their internal propaganda, it is a direct reference to reunification, and importantly, reunification on their terms. And this is one of the challenges in this issue. Despite both Koreas being committed to a reunification of the peninsula, both sides are also committed to that unification coming about on their terms. And yet, despite the gulf between these two parties and these two visions of the future, it hasn't seemed to have hampered the issue, or the national identification with the issue that has progressed throughout the years. And all this is just another step that belies the difficulties in the process. Reunification, if it comes about, could come about through conquest and war, with either North Korea or South Korea dominating the other. It could come about through limited military engagement from either side, and a broader political pressure from there. Failing this, it could be a regime collapse, the end of Kim Jong-un, the end of the Kim dynasty, and a new, changed regime looking differently at the world and differently at South Korea. There is a prospect of North Korea simply absorbing the South, or the South absorbing the North, and there is the process that people seem to talk about the most, that of a peaceful negotiation, of a low-level confederation, of trust-building exercises, and then step-by-step building towards broader political integration. But the challenges present in this field are in some ways overwhelming. There is the issue of North Korean weapons of mass destruction, of a heavily armed and populated North Korean military, of a poorly prepared South Korean army for the complexities of reunification and societal pacification, the challenging roles and the likely intervention of America and China, and the strategic difficulties of either side successfully planning for reunification and finding a place within this new society for the elites of the other. But of course, what comes through most strongly through this sort of research is the haunting spectre of war and conflict, and of this being a likely avenue towards any potential unification, despite how fraught this is and despite how desperate both sides would be to avoid this scenario, and of the long-term disabling effects this would have on the peninsula. It is incredibly unlikely that a war resulting in reunification would not then also bring about some sort of internal insurgency, some sort of civil war inside both Koreas. There would be the issue of the elite and of the regular everyday citizens who are simply unwilling to accept the change in their society, the change in their identity, and the new ideological world in which they have been forced to live under. Beyond this are the structural limitations of each side's economic order. The difference in freedom, the difference in entrepreneurialism, the difference in education, and the different ways they look at their own government and what they expect from them. And of course, through all of this is the emphasis and the need for any reunification, whatever it may look like, to come about peacefully. But there are significant disconnects in how this might happen. There is an American administration at the moment with Donald Trump at their head that is ostensibly negotiating for a denuclearization deal, while on the sidelines, the two Koreas are talking more about low-level confederation, about trust building, and of economic cooperation. And this is moving ahead at a much greater speed than the nuclear negotiations. The current South Korean administration under Moon Jae-in and under a new Sunshine Policy-esque détente are pushing this process forward with a speed and a willingness, which makes this question and this issue of Korean reunifications and the scenarios under which this might happen more and more prescient each day. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and you can support it in various ways. You can go to the Patreon link or the PayPal link attached below, or you can simply comment, share, and like this podcast on social media. On that, and to walk us through the pathways to Korean reunification, this is Bruce Bennett. Bruce Bennett, welcome to the Korean Now podcast.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
Now, you've done an awful lot of research on Korean unification, Korean reunification, and this is a lot of long-form, really deeply researched, really deeply thought-through articles. And one of your most recent ones is about alternative paths to Korean reunification. So as we walk through this today, I might get you to expound on some of these details that you touched on here. And I suppose the first one that we need to look at, one of the first key issues here, is what do we mean when we talk about reunification, or what Korean reunification looks like. So I might get you to touch on some of the core details here. So most people have a broad idea of reunification, two countries coming together. But I suppose one of the intermediate steps here for many people would be confederation. So I might get you to talk us through how that politically would walk through, and just what a confederation would mean prior to reunification.
Well, none of these terms are fully and finally defined. Different authors use different terminology for them. I usually see three kinds of terms that are used to characterize a reunification, largely based upon a book written by Kim Dae-jung. So the three terms are confederation, federation, and full unification. Confederation is a very loose grouping, according to this, where the two countries still exist essentially independently, but they're coordinating some activities. The next step up is a federation, where more than likely their national security activities, foreign affairs, and so forth are done by a unified body, but most everything else, healthcare, food, all of those kinds of things, are still done separately by the country. And then finally, a full unification would be literally that. You would be fully unified as two countries. There are a variety of alternatives that people talk about, or adjustments to these, but those seem to be the standard three stages that I hear people discuss.
And there is also another element in this. People's imaginations tend to imagine two countries coming back together. But through a lot of your research, you talk about an idea that people often don't think about enough. That's the idea that this might be a partial geographic reunification. That is, China may intervene, or importantly, there may be an issue of states from either North Korea or South Korea refusing to accept the reunification. And this brings in another aspect of your research, that is, in such a situation, it would be vitally important for the military to begin these stabilization processes almost immediately, that the future planning for Korea cannot be something that is done after any final victory, I suppose.
Oh, exactly. The quandary you face is both countries today, both North Korea and South Korea, have a variety of concepts that they have fielded that would suggest what each stage of unification might look like. Kim Jong-un is not interested in a South Korea-led unification. South Korea generally believes that North Korea can't lead the unification. They don't have the power. But depending upon which has the lead, the other country is going to be very worried about how their rights and liberties would be affected. And that then leads to a need for stabilization to try to create the unification. Under a confederation, not much needs to be done. Under full unification, you could see in a North Korea-led unification that the North is taking the internet away from people in South Korea. Boy, would there be fighting against that. You could see them purging the chaebol leadership and putting their own people in place. So you get to some very extreme cases that would have to be imposed by some form of police and military intervention.
And at this point, I suppose it is important to bring in a new idea here. That is, I'm sure you've come across this. I have myself. Many people out there in the Pyongyang watching community have their doubts, and also Koreanologists, I suppose, as well. They have their doubts about reunification. They doubt whether North Korea really wants it, and they doubt whether South Korea really wants it. So I might get you to touch on this idea, because even if it's not something explicitly said by the North, though it is explicitly said a lot, when they speak about things like final victories, often this is what they're talking about, Korean reunification. And you have mentioned a few times through your work here that it is impossible to find a South Korean president that is not committed to this idea, even if you go back to someone who they believe to be quite far to the right, like Park Geun-hye. She had this idea of a trust politic, but she spoke about this being this economic bonanza for South Korea. It's not something that seems to shift from the spectrum here.
No, that's right. The South Korean presidents and certainly the North Korean leaders have traditionally each touted unification. Kim Jong-un spoke of unification 7 times in his 2019 New Year's Day address. And it was very clear he was talking about North Korea-led unification. So these countries have very different perspectives on what they're talking about when they're talking about unification. That means that while they're using one word, you've got a big difference in what the potential implications of that would be.
So let's move on to some of the challenges of the unification. And I'm glad you just mentioned there a couple of times how important it is that North Korea see reunification as their reunification, not a joint, but this is going to be the whole South Korea is going to be subsumed under North Korea. And you have this wonderful quote that you brought up in a couple of your articles of this instance of Kim Jong-un trying to impress his father and talking about if Korea doesn't exist, then what is the point of the rest of the world existing? And you use this quite rightly to show that there is at least a possibility that in any conflict or any realization that North Korea would fall, and that includes being subsumed under South Korea, that these nuclear weapons may be used against South Korea. It's one of those things that people imagine is just not possible, not on the cards, but it seems to be the case that there is that escape valve there.
Well, yeah, I was in a conference yesterday where a couple of the participants were saying war between North and South Korea is impossible because both sides know how bad it would be, and so they'll never let it happen. But accidents happen. And back in 1993, during the first nuclear crisis, Kim Il-sung called together his senior leadership, and he asked them, if we fight against the Americans over our nuclear program and we lose, what do we do? And his son, Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, spoke up and said, if we lose, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? Now, in my discussion, my discussions with North Korean senior defectors, they will say, well, of course they would say that because they're trying to deter the South and the U.S. from thinking about that kind of conflict outcome. But the reality is they're threatening some pretty serious things. They can't destroy the earth with tanks and rifles, probably can't do it with nuclear weapons and contagious biological weapons, but they could sure cause a lot of damage. And they were very clear, Kim Jong-il was very clear he was talking about the earth. That includes China. His intent to basically cause massive damage to China. That's something the Chinese know, and which will lead them to be prepared to intervene in the North if something ever goes down like this.
And another military aspect along this line, one of these barriers to reunification, is the enormous standing army, particularly in North Korea, but of course there is also a significantly large one, though often reserve forces are not that well trained in South Korea. And you mentioned this is important because there's I suppose a role or a facilitation will have to be found for these troops in North Korea, because one of the fears, as we've seen in other conflicts when a regime has fallen like Iraq, is the great fear that military men and women who no longer have a job may very well easily fall into a insurgency of sorts?
Sure. Some of the early estimates that I saw of the Iraqi insurgency in 2003 suggested that the number of insurgents was in the ballpark between 10 and 20,000. North Korea's got an active duty army of over 1 million and probably another 500,000 security services and related personnel who are probably in many ways even more capable in an insurgency than the standard military. So South Korea's army today is down from 560,000 a decade or so down to 460,000. But President Moon plans for that to reduce to about 360,000 by the time he leaves office. An army of 360,000 is not going to get the North under control with as large a military force, probably 1.5 million people. If only half of them go into insurgency, that is going to be very hard to deal with.
And on that point, one of the things that you do bring up is a relatively inadequate training for these troops in South Korea, particularly the reserve troops, and I suppose specifically inadequate for such a complex situation. This won't be simply defending South Korea, though it may, of course, start like that. But the complexities involved in what would it be I suppose, a battle for the homeland and then a reunification or an assault on North Korea. You mentioned a few times that the South Korean, at least the South Korean reserve troops, especially when it's compared to other countries like America, they're just not very prepared at all.
Well, so the South Korean reserves have almost all served on active duty. So they have that experience, but they're still in the reserves for many years thereafter. And they're training at a most, with rare exception, the most is 3 days a year. In 3 days a year, they get to fire 10 rounds of ammunition. If their job in a conflict is to stand north of Seoul and shoot at anybody who is coming at them, that might work. But if you've got to go do counterinsurgency, you need substantial unit cohesion. The United States talks about its reserves who do 35 or 40 days a year of service as being not prepared for counterinsurgency activity and requiring a significant train-up period after they have activated. Well, the ROK forces aren't going to have likely a significant train-up period. Therefore, at least some of them need to be much better prepared to deal with this changed requirement, not just shoot at North Koreans coming south, but being able to go into the north and solidify the country and stabilize it. That's a very demanding role.
And along that same line is the issue of American forces. Now, this has been in the news a lot recently with certain, of course, Kim Jong-un would like American forces to leave, and they have this summit come up between Trump and Kim. But of course, there has just recently been an agreement on the cost sharing arrangement between South Korea and America, but only 1 year, so it's going to have to roll over for another year, and this is a great big challenge. But because of that, I suppose, that seemingly closeness of the relationship between South Korea and North Korea, people take for granted the idea that America will be there immediately in the case of a war. But you, through your research, you have shown that there is a problem here, and that is a relatively slow deployment of U.S. troops. Now, not slow compared to other countries, but the American troops would deploy often slower than many people have in their mind, which of course would open the gate for insurgencies, or if it's a war that they're deploying for, open the gate for the reunification not under South Korea but under North Korea.
Well, that's the case. If indeed you have no problem deploying forces, it can still take months before a substantial part of the U.S. military would be present in Korea. The advantage the U.S. has today is with 28,500 troops deployed in Korea, we have bases and other facilities that would be available to help us deploy. One of the concerns that the U.S. has is if U.S. forces were withdrawn from Korea, we would lose those facilities And then the deployment would become nigh on impossible for a substantial number of Americans to come. So this is a long process. It's a long process which is shortened by U.S. presence forward, but it's also a long process that could be lengthened. What happens if North Korea explodes nuclear weapons on Pusan and other major facilities for deployment? That's only going to slow the effort even further and give North Korea time to take some pretty withering actions. So this is a case where we have to be worried. You can't just get there right away.
And that is, I suppose, a military intervention from the south. But of course, coming from the north would be China. And this is another issue when it comes to reunification that would slow it down or potentially sway it towards the balance of North Korea. And that is this idea that China is right on the border with North Korea, of course, and they have a lot of strategic interests in not just having North Korea as an ally, but in ensuring things like, I suppose, nuclear weapons don't become loose or are not being exploded just across their border. You're not having insurgencies, you're not having mass flows of refugees. So I might get to walk us through this issue of looking towards a fall of the North Korean government or a reunification, or even if it's open at the time and unsure what's going to happen. Of China, how likely do you see their intervention in North Korea?
Well, so Xi Jinping has said that he will not allow war or chaos to develop on the peninsula. Here's a Chinese leader who can't stop North Korea from launching ballistic missile tests. So the way he would have to stop war or chaos on the peninsula is by inserting Chinese ground forces into North Korea. A couple of major developments there have occurred in recent years. China has been exercising exercises that have been captured in the media that appear to look like China's preparing to intervene in North Korea if indeed war or chaos happens. But equally importantly, China in recent years has reorganized its military. It used to be that the military facing North Korea was the Shenyang military region, which would have allowed Chinese forces to come into North Korea from the north, a fairly long distance from Pyongyang in control. But when China reorganized its military forces, it added to the Shenyang military region many forces that are directly west of the Korean peninsula and created a northern theater under one command. That means that China is potentially prepared to move into North Korea not only from the north, but also from the west, initially probably with airborne and amphibious troops, and then with follow-on other troops. So China has been posturing itself to intervene. If China does that, they can send in troops across the border very quickly, within a matter of days at most. And certainly airborne troops could go in very rapidly. They could move much more quickly and face much less opposition than South Korean and U.S. forces would face. And we would not be very well prepared until we've gone through these weeks or months of deployments.
The last time that we spoke together, we went through a lot of your research on the idea of the North Korean elite and the failure or the need for planning for what we're going to do or what South Korea would do with these North Korean elites in any eventual reunification. And this is one of the issues that comes up again and again and again. So I might get you to touch on this idea of planning for a replacement government in North Korea, because this is one of those, it's often and strangely neglected out there in academia, this idea that you're not just going to have a smooth transition. People, the elite, not just Kim Jong-un, but the upper regime, have a vested interest in the North Korean structure, the North Korean leadership, and how North Korea exists today. And if it were subsumed under South Korea, then their lives would be dramatically different. So I might get you to walk us through this planning process. And in some ways, the reading of it is that it might be slightly inadequate from the South Korean side.
Well, so most of the South Korean planning for unification assumes that South Korea is controlling the unification process. that South Korea is going in and clearing out the Communist Party members and doing essentially what the United States did in Iraq in 2003 and 2004. We know how well that worked in Iraq. We pulled all of the Ba'ath Party members, or almost all, out of the government, including the technocrats. And you had two consequences. Number one, many of those people, now without jobs, were very willing to go into the insurgency. And number two, for a period of perhaps 10 years, the Iraqi government didn't work very well. People with experience who knew how to keep water systems working and make sure trash got collected and all of those kinds of things, they were gone. And you had people coming in who knew nothing about how to do that. Now, South Korea is better prepared. They do have people who have been chosen to go in and do those roles, but they don't know the North Korean systems. They don't know the fact that you've got a 60-year-old water system that's supporting some cities, or a 60-year-old electrical system. So you've got a problem with trying to decide, if you do have a South Korea-led unification, how much of the North Korean structure do you leave in place? The more you try to replace, the more people in the North you're going to alienate, because those people, they perceive themselves as being important. They know how to deal with the North Korean population. We may not like them, but if you take them out, you jeopardize your ability to control North Korea and to know about the system. The biggest problem that South Korea has, they have an organization which is generally referred to in English as the Commission of the Five Provinces. These are the governors which South Korea has chosen from South Korean citizens to go in and take over the provinces in North Korea, and they have mayors that are assigned to them to take over the cities in the north. Well, that means all of those mayors and governors and other officials in the north are going to perceive that we don't like them and that we're not going to work with them. And that is going to drive them into insurgency, not something we want. I've argued that this is a case where if President Moon is really serious about an eventual unification, he should change the charters of this organization so that the individuals in it are assigned to be the advisors to the governors and the advisors to the mayors of North Korea, thereby signaling to the North Koreans that we don't plan to go in and do extensive purges. We are going to work with them. This would be a real unification and not just a South Korean absorption of the North.
And for people listening, I will offer a link below to our previous podcast where we went into that in a lot more detail. But with that basic framework behind us here, let's move on to some scenarios for reunification. And you mentioned earlier how, I suppose, realistic it is, the prospect of war, even if most people just cannot imagine it on the Korean Peninsula. But so let's move forward to some of the war-related paths to unification. And the first one, and the one that seems to catch most of the headlines here, is a reunification following a North Korean invasion of the South. So what would this look like? I might get to walk us through this and offer some of the military explanations for this, and how realistic you think this is as a path towards reunification.
Well, we do not have access to the North Korean war plans for attacking the South. So we're reading a bit between the lines, quite a bit between the lines. But key here is, what does North Korea think it can do with its military forces? Does it really think that it can win a conventional war against South Korea and the U.S.? I have to think the answer to that question is there's no way they're going to overcome U.S. and South Korean conventional superiority. So they've got to be considering a different approach. The evidence I see, including North Korean refugees who've testified to Congress, some of the most senior North Korean military refugees who've come out of the North, have said that the North Korean leaders believe that if they can kill roughly 20,000 Americans right at the beginning of a conflict, the Americans will withdraw from the peninsula because we no longer have the stomach for major attrition warfare. This is new information that we're learning, but I'm hearing from it both evidence from defectors from 20 years ago, but also people who've left North Korea much more recently under the Kim Jong-un period. What would they have to do that? Camp Humphreys, the big U.S. military base in South Korea, has today over 30,000 people living there. If North Korea struck that base with a nuclear weapon in a surprise attack, you'd get more than 20,000 casualties. Now, there is the problem, though. North Korea perceives that would lead to an American withdrawal from the peninsula. I can't imagine that. Here is North Korea causing more than 10 times the damage of Pearl Harbor, and the Americans are just going to walk away. I think more likely the United States will cause major destruction in the North, substantial damage in many, many places in the North in retaliation. This is not a way for the North to guarantee regime survival. This is a way for the North to guarantee regime destruction. The U.S. has said very clearly that if North Korea ever uses a nuclear weapon, the regime will not survive. And this is a case where, while we can't predict with precision what the president will do because it's a presidential decision to use nuclear weapons or military forces, I think a president would be impeached if he did not respond very overwhelmingly against such a North Korean attack.
I might offer another thought here. There's something that has been coming to me recently. I've heard a lot of people making the argument, and it's along just that scenario that you mentioned there. I agree with everything that you've said there. It seems to be entirely plausible. But some people inside South Korea, the older generation that are more worried, believe in some ways that a blitzkrieg attack that takes the peninsula in a month, so to speak, would have North Korea in control of the peninsula. And then, of course, as you mentioned, America would have the deaths of those American servicemen, not to mention the attack on an ally, and they would respond. But these people have a fear that North Korea, in that situation, they could hunker down, and despite American bombing, American attacks, they may be able to press the idea that this is too costly an outcome in terms of putting American troops on the ground. And I suppose over time, and this is, I suppose, the crux of the question, convince South Koreans, even if you're unhappy being under Kim Jong-un, even if you're unhappy under a reunification by North Korea, the alternative is a long and protracted war. So it might get you to talk through that potential scenario and what you think about it.
Sure. North Korea doesn't just have nuclear weapons. They have chemical and biological weapons as well. So if the North decides to invade, it could use a few nuclear weapons to try to push the U.S. out, to try to make it so that the U.S. would have difficulty deploying its forces to Korea. But along the demilitarized zone, they would likely be using extensive amounts of North Korean chemical weapons. We believe, it's been published in the South Korean white paper, that North Korea has somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. And it takes much less than a gram of nerve agents to kill people. So this is a huge amount of chemical that they have. Could they go through the South Korean defenses in the forward area with using these weapons? Yeah, quite possibly they could. And so in theory, they may believe that within a month, they could be in control of Peninsula before the U.S. has been able to make any substantial force deployment to the Peninsula. Could the North continue to hold on then? Well, with their nuclear and chemical and biological threats to any follow-on American force, it would make the U.S. deployment at that stage very difficult. So the U.S. has got to plan to get enough forces here early to stop such a thing, to be prepared to use, if necessary, U.S. nuclear weapons, the only form of weapons of mass destruction the U.S. has, to counter the North Korean use of weapons of mass destruction. And back in the 1980s, in the NATO Central Front, we anticipated that nuclear weapons would be used on D-Day or very shortly thereafter, right at the beginning of a conflict. And we had extensive development of concepts of nuclear warfighting so that we could win such a conflict and deal with the pressure that the Soviets would be able to place in that case, because the Soviets had conventional force superiority. So this is the kind of thing where the US and South Korea need to be looking at a different kind of threat environment, trying to be able to stop North Korea from being able to rapidly seize the peninsula. How can we do that? How do we flow forces in case we're in another Pusan perimeter condition like we were in late 1950, and be able to deal with whatever it is that North Korea decides to do? That's different from what traditionally we've thought about.
And all that implies a cold, rational calculation for reunification, and then a trigger point which they've chosen, North Korea in this behalf, have chosen to take. But one of the emergent trends here, of course, and this is what a lot of people out there are considerably worried about, is this risk of miscalculation, and that is the idea of limited. In the past, it's been the idea of limited attacks by North Korea, such as the sinking of the SS Cheonan or the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island. That these limited attacks, which they have done many, many times over the history, may provoke a much larger conflict than they had in mind. And of course, that conflict may lead to reunification. But now, of course, there's the other side of that debate as well. And that is with Donald Trump and now Johnson in power, you now have this a explicitly mentioned idea of limited attacks on North Korean nuclear facilities and military sites. So let's take us there. Take us to this idea of miscalculation leading to broader conflict and then reunification.
Well, the first thing is it may not be so much a miscalculation with a limited attack. Sinking of the Cheonan accomplished political purposes for North Korea internally that were very important. And they didn't miscalculate. The South did not escalate. So they may be doing something they perceive as very rational for their own objectives with a limited attack. The problem had developed after the Cheonan and after the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, when South Korea developed its proactive deterrence concept, which basically is, if you fire at me, I'm going to fire 3 to 5 times as much back and attack other things. That's escalatory. And the question is, if there is a limited attack, what is the potential for an escalation spiral to develop where you simply go to each side doing more and more severe actions until you're in a major war, including the exchange of chemical and biological and nuclear weapons? That's very risky. The South Korean doctrine of its kill chain, where it would try to preemptively destroy the North Korean ballistic missile and nuclear weapon force, is a very escalatory concept. It is what we called in the Cold War it would put North Korea in a use it or lose it mode. If they don't fire their nuclear weapons at the very beginning, those weapons could be destroyed, and that's not what they want to have happen. So there are some real risks of instability on the Korean Peninsula now from the different doctrines and strategies of both sides that could lead to an escalation where not such a thing was ever intended in the first place. It was just intended to do some low-level leverage. That's where there's got to be far more intensive thinking about what the course of a campaign would look like in Korea. You've got to have a firm concept of What are proportional or limited responses? How do we try to manage the escalation process? What image do we try to get Kim Jong-un to recognize? Does Kim Jong-un know that if he uses a nuclear weapon that he is going to be killed? Because that's the U.S. doctrine. We need to make sure he knows that. During the Cold War, we had a concept called assured destruction. The assured destruction concept called for destroying 75% of Soviet industry and half of the Soviet urban population. That's brutal. That's extreme. And most Americans would object to that kind of concept. But it was a very good deterrent because it told the Soviet Union, you can't use a nuclear weapon and survive and do well. You're just not going to be able to do that. And we've got to make sure from a deterrence perspective that Kim Jong-un understands the same kind of thing.
And you mentioned there, I suppose, a lot, this idea of mass destruction coming from nuclear weapons, but also chemical, biological weapons, for example. And there is this concern here that there is no conceivable, as you mentioned, there's no conceivable way of imagining a war between North Korea and South Korea, where Kim Jong-un imagines his fate as his regime will fall and he will be either prosecuted or he will die in the process, and not use these nuclear weapons in some capacity, even as a last desperate attempt to hold the world to account. And you mentioned a few times throughout your research here that there is a desperate need, and it's often an underappreciated need out there, that you can train forces in a way, and you can build a military in a way to fight within the environment of weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons. That as devastating as these things are, you have to then prepare your troops to be equipped and prepare buy and develop the right equipment. So how ready are the South Koreans, I suppose, because they're going to bear most of the brunt of this, ready for war fighting in the environment of a nuclear weapon?
Well, the South Koreans have made considerable progress against the chemical and biological weapons compared to 20 years ago. They're much further along in their preparation. But all forces could use even more preparation and just the kind of thing that you require. What's less clear is that the countries have really prepared for nuclear warfare. In the 1980s, you probably couldn't become an American general rank officer or admiral without substantial training in nuclear weapons. It was just part of what was expected in a conflict in any place in the world. And so the senior leaders were trained. Starting in about 1991, much of that training went away. And so the US leaders aren't getting that training. The South Korean leaders don't have even that history. And so many of their senior officers have just not been trained in the nature of a nuclear campaign. More has got to be done to help prepare the leadership on both sides. And once the leadership has got a good idea of what's involved, there'll be much more effort to provide the resources and the training and other preparations needed to deal with what would be a very hostile environment. And I'm not saying that you can lower the casualties to zero, but you can lower the casualties significantly if you take the right kinds of actions.
And one of the precipitators for reunification that people have had over the years is this idea of regime collapse. And it was felt after Kim Il-sung died, and I remember quite a lot of people out there in the media talking about the idea that North Korea would collapse when Kim Jong-il died and Kim Jong-un took over. So this is it's very easy to imagine the truth and the claims behind this theory, the idea that if Kim Jong-un died, there was no successor in place. There is a feel that the government could break into factionalism and then the country could dissolve from there, and this could be a path towards reunification, a messy path, no doubt. And you talk through this quite a lot, and you mention there will be a number of factors involved in if this does come to be, and that would be a South Korean involvement. South Korea would likely push north, China would likely push south, and there would be very real prospect inside North Korea of civil war.
Yeah. So I think what you have to look at here is, in a collapse, right now, Kim Jong-un has no interest to designate a number two, because the number two becomes then his primary potential for replacement, his competitor. So he's been very careful to not let anybody become a really credible number two leader of North Korea. Several have moved into the appearance of that kind of position and then been purged not too long afterwards. So Kim has been very careful there. He doesn't have a family member who is of an age to take over, unless maybe you consider his sister, but I think his sister is still, in a Korean context, probably not an acceptable alternative to many people in North Korea. So not clear that there would be an obvious replacement. Likely there would be some form of committee of the leaders who would try to hide his death and set it up so that they decided who it was who would be the follow-on leader. That follow-on leader could be, it most likely would be a capitalist. Many of the senior elites in North Korea are very much involved in markets, buying and selling, and some are literally capitalists at this stage. So it's not necessarily bad to have some of these alternative people take over control or control of factions within the North, because they're going to be much easier to deal with than the Kim family would likely be. Hopefully you can get some kind of change like that. We don't know how unstable North Korea is, but I was really struck by an article in Yonhap News recently where they said that historically, of course, the North Korean government says, do this because Kim Jong-un told you to do it. You know, he's in theory the god of North Korea. Now they appear to be saying, do this for the good of the state. Has Kim really fallen that far from his position of authority and recognition that they have to use the authority of the state as a way of motivating behavior? I don't know that's true, but if it is, there are some really significant changes occurring in the North, and we ought to be monitoring them very carefully.
So that is an interesting point that you bring up there, the idea that any change inside North Korea wouldn't necessarily be a bad change, especially if that was a capitalistic change, because that would imply not so much a collapse, but a slow negotiation towards reunification. So let's take us there, this idea that Kim does fall either through illness or death or by any other means, and then the faction that takes over are capitalists. They want reunification with the South just for those benefits. And then you have it would be, I imagine, a long staggered process towards full reunification, going through those steps of trust building and confederation. And I suppose I want you to bring in another element here, and this is one of the great challenges that many people mention in the South here. That is the idea that it is often presented in the South as an economic boom to have have reunification. But on the other side, people often talk about the inherent costs. And of course, this is one of those huge challenges here of, are South Korea really ready to absorb their North, even if that North is swaying capitalist, but they are dramatically less developed, dramatically less wealthy, dramatically less educated, and not prepared for a tough, a fast-paced South Korean lifestyle.
No, there would not be a rapid unification in the aftermath of a death of Kim Jong-un and a more capitalistic government development. People are going to take some time to adjust to that new world. And so it would have to be done in a very patient and positive manner. Now, that's actually good in many ways for South Korea. If South Korea suddenly had to take over the North, military forces going into the North or whatever, have to stabilize the North, have to try to take care of famine in the North and all those kinds of things, that's really not in South Korea's best interest to have those burdens. If they can get North Korean leadership to take care of the immediate requirements of the North Korean people with assistance from the South, but not total control, and gradually change, build up the economy in the North, create a more liberal democratic environment, a more capitalistic environment, that's probably the ideal way to get to a unification. It has very few of the kinds of downsides of going in and being responsible for collecting the trash tomorrow.
Do you think from your research that Kim Jong-un is recognizing this liability? I know the rise of the free market and individual capitalism inside North Korea, came about almost organically after the famine, where the regime just wasn't able to monitor or its population in the same way and wasn't able to distribute food. So people left to themselves naturally started to launch their own market stalls, and it exploded from there. And as we've seen all around the world, once capitalism does take over, it is a form of freedom, and freedom is very hard to wind back in people's lives. But you sent me through an article during the week that people, this idea that inside North Korea, there may be a growing fear of this. And this is the idea that there may be a desire inside some of the North Korean elite to wind this back. Yes, have a stronger, more prosperous, richer North Korea, but a return to the 1980s, the idea of a centrally planned economy and food distributions, the idea that you can control the country the same way Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather perhaps did. And from there, you can seek international aid, you can seek sanctions relief and things like this. But fundamentally, there is a fear of the rise in economy.
Well, certainly we can perceive that Kim might fear that. I mean, you have to recognize, to the extent that there are capitalists in North Korea, to people with lots of money, people who can bribe security service people, they're establishing a degree of independence. That is independence that Kim Jong-un does not want people to have, especially people he hasn't chosen to have that independence. So the overall capitalism is not a thing that Kim is going to want. And many of the people are also going to be thinking, who are not in the capitalist or entrepreneurial grouping, are going to be thinking, we're getting the rich and the poor here in North Korea too. We'd like to go back to a public distribution, which makes sure we all get to eat. So there would be people who would oppose a major capitalistic swing, but I think most of them would be senior leaders now in the government who are not associated with the markets. I think increasingly the numbers of those people are smaller and smaller. And so I think the likelihood is if the Kim family goes away, there is going to be a tendency to move not towards a South Korean liberal democratic capitalistic society, but probably towards a Chinese style capitalism, at least in the early days. And then there needs to be plans for how you get better agreement between the economic situation of the North and the South.
Now, one of the things that people always comes to mind when they talk about Korean reunification is the example of German reunification. And it's understandable why they do this. And you do mention it a lot throughout this particular research, but you mention it in a way that people should be more wary than they are hopeful of this. the analogy makes sense on a superficial level, but once you dig a bit deeper, there are more and more challenges here. That is the idea that very, very quickly after German reunification, almost most of the military most of the East German military were simply dissolved. Many people in government in the East lost their jobs. So a huge disenfranchisement occurred in this regard. There is a huge concern that if the economy opened up, there would be the sort of taxes and challenges for the South Korean economy that may make the whole idea of an economic reunification a big challenge here. And if you look back to the German example, there are still significant lasting discrepancies and lasting differences between quality of life between East and West Germany, and that's 30 years ago these days. So how do you look upon this German reunification example, and is there anything that we can gain from this, or is it just one of those things that people have brought up over the years because it seems to fit, but in reality it is, I suppose, more wrong with it than there is right?
Well, German reunification offers a variety of examples, some of good things and some of not so good things. So it is still an important example. It's important to note that for North Korea, it is not the example that they cite. North Korea cites the Vietnam example, which makes the whole trip to Hanoi in 2 weeks very interesting. They like the example where the North takes over the South, and within 10 years, they're doing business with the United States. They have good relationships, and the North is in control. So we have to take a quick look at the examples and see what happened in property rights, what happened in transitional justice, what happened in many of these things that are required to get a unification, and make sure that the path ahead makes sense from what you're trying to accomplish with the people. Some things from Germany were done very well, other things not so well. And you can't just look at it as an example of how to do this right.
Just on that, you mentioned here, and this is quite interesting, the idea, and this is one of the failures, I think, of people's imagination, this failure of the idea of an equal unification. And you say you quite rightly highlight here that the only example in history of an equal unification or equal joining of two countries is Yemen, and that shows all the challenges there because, of course, the country has exploded into civil war. And that is, I suppose, the great challenge, I think, in many people's minds here, that it is always presented as a great success for both countries. But there's no great example that I can imagine in history of an equal reunification.
Well, and so, think about it just in simple terms. If you have an equal unification, does the North get full access to the international internet, or is full access to the international internet in South Korea taken away? Very simple example of what would be the decision, who would be making that decision, and as you started to try to make that decision, the battles, at least initially verbally, but potentially physically at some point, over which direction you would be going, those battles could be pretty severe.
So let's talk through one of the more fascinating aspects here of this reunification. Again, something that I don't think many people imagine could be a real possibility, but it really does come up through the research, and it does come up through the policies and the stated goals of both countries here. This is the idea of, from North Korea on that side, the idea of a absorption path to reunification, but an absorption path from the North. Now, people often imagine the South slowly winning over the North step by step by playing up this idea of a better life. And but not many people look the opposite way. But this is what Kim Jong-un mentioned a lot when he does his speeches. And this is often what people are saying when this summit is coming up between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, that when Kim Jong-un is asking for a removal of American troops, what he really is doing is opening the way forward, not for a military intervention, but for his détente, I suppose, for the South Korean people, his political outreach program, where he can begin to say, we should reunify, and we can reunify under me. And this is one of the concerns in many people's voices, is how fast Moon Jae-in has been moving forward with, I suppose, small-scale steps towards sanctions relief and even confederation, at least in principle. So let's take us there, this idea of absorption from the DPRK. How realistic is this, and how do you see this progressing?
Well, so the kind of scenario there that you could imagine is an initial step to a confederation, where the central body of the confederation involves 3 representatives from the north and 3 from the south. Kim Jong-un would own the 3 from the north, and if you believe some people in the south, he would probably own 1 or 2 of the representatives from the south. He may say initially, well, let's finish getting the Americans off peninsula. We don't need the Americans here. Once U.S. forces leave the peninsula, they are probably never going to be coming back, even in a wartime situation. They just would not have the facilities and the ability to do that very easily. Once they leave, you've got a situation where if the representatives of this 6-party commission say, you know, we'd like to have the South provide a 5 trillion won per year subsidy to the North Korean economy so that it can start building up and we can get to a more equal economy. I mean, an equitable economic balance. And then the next year it's 10 trillion won. And then the next year it's 20 trillion won. Does the North try to take advantage of that kind of thing where they don't rule the South, but where they are taking substantial resources from the South to help them economically and so forth? The problem the North would face in that kind of regard is how far can they go before all of the information that would come with that economic subsidy would start giving Kim Jong-un trouble in maintaining control. His people would be making contact with people in the South. Information would be flowing up more readily. And at some point, he's probably going to have to terminate that if he wants to maintain control just of the North. So it's not necessarily a way to a North Korean-led unification. Could go that direction, but with all kinds of risks to Kim Jong-un.
And of course, the hope in the South Korean side is often seen through the media. It's often why Moon Jae-in, a lot of his popularity, at least before coming to power, was based on this idea that he would eventually, through, as you mentioned, through slow steps and confederation, absorb the North. So let's go there for a second. This idea of a ROK, or Republic of Korea, South Korea, absorbing the North. So what does this scenario look like, and how plausible is it?
Well, the hope, I think, for many in South Korea is that as reconciliation goes on, the North wants support from the South. The South is going to give some economic support once the UN sanctions are relaxed, and that gradually there will be an influence from the South of liberal democracy, market capitalism, all of those kinds of things that would simply overwhelm the current North Korean philosophy and culture and give the South gradually control over the North. That's very hopeful. It might go that direction. Certainly, if Kim Jong-un doesn't try to impose limitations on the developments, it could go that way. But it's not easy to make that kind of thing happen. He is going to recognize the threat, I believe, and he is going to put some real limitations on the exchanges that are possible. I've been a little surprised because President Moon was so interested in the North-South Basic Agreement of 1991, which had all kinds of exchanges that were supposed to happen between the North and the South. And he tried to pattern a lot of that into the April 27 Panmunjom Agreement. I just haven't seen those exchanges happening with the frequency and the numbers that I had been expecting would be happening. I think the North has been trying to slow roll those developments.
So, in a final couple of colluding questions here, let's finish this off, and let's finish off with I suppose a nice little summary of where we're going here. I take it from what you've been intimating throughout this discussion and explicitly saying that despite there being quite realistic paths to reunification through conflict, that you don't see this as a viable choice that anyone should willingly take, North or South Korea.
Oh, exactly. With weapons of mass destruction and especially nuclear weapons, a major war breaking out in Korea could cause 5 to 10 times the casualties of the original Korean War. The original Korean War was devastating, both in terms of people lost and infrastructure destroyed. We don't want that. That would not be a good outcome.
And you just mentioned it in your previous question there, the idea of Moon Jae-in, I suppose, very eager to reach out to North Korea here. And you mentioned here a few times throughout your work this idea that there is an important factor that has often been missed here, and that is that it's understandable that North Korea are not being upfront with their own citizens, but it's important that South Korea are more upfront with their own citizens about the realities and the objectives of North Korea and Kim Jong-un. And importantly, you should, I suppose, go to greater extent to impress upon South Korean people just what Kim Jong-un really is after here.
Well, sure. I mean, let's take the call for an end of war agreement. People are talking about that in terms of ending the 1950 to 53 war. Why aren't we talking about ending the Cold War that's been going on since 1953? I mean, North Korea probably increased their nuclear destructive potential 70% last year. That's not peace. That's a Cold War at very least. North Korea trains their nursery school children how to bayonet American soldiers. That's not peace. That's a Cold War. North Korea indoctrinates its people that the United States is their eternal enemy. That's not peace. That's Cold War. I think any agreement that's going to be made between the United States and North Korea has got to end both wars, the hot war of 50 to 53 and the Cold War that has existed since. If we don't, we're getting a bad deal, because you're not going to have the kind of peace you want as long as North Korea continues to pursue this Cold War that it's been pursuing now for decades.
And as a final question here, we are in a fairly unique place right now in regard to this question and this research, this reunification idea. We have, of course, another summit coming up in just a couple of weeks between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And this, throughout the whole of last year, has been I suppose, a fairly unique reaching out between both countries to bring them close together. Now, of course, for many people, such as the American administration, this is about denuclearization. But it's very clear from North Korean side and from South Korean side that this is also very, very, very much about reunification. So I might ask you the impossible question here. How do you see the next year or so playing out, or the next couple of years? Is there any real hope to be optimistic here, or is this just another cycling in the same process and we are effectively at a deadlock here?
We don't know at this stage. It will depend upon the willingness of both President Trump and Chairman Kim at the end of February to take the issues on solidly and get some substantive resolution. Arguably, Kim Jong-un has made some major mistakes in his campaign on denuclearization. He, back in May of last year, South Korean opinion polls said over 75% of South Koreans thought they could trust Kim Jong-un. By December, the number was under 40%. He's losing the public trust, and he doesn't understand public trust and its importance, admittedly, but he's losing it in among Americans too. This is a case where he's got to start doing some things. He could choose to say, well, I'm still not ready to do anything substantive. If he does, then we go a whole different course. If he decides to say, look, I promised January 1st to produce no more nuclear weapons, so starting tomorrow, you can send a team to Yongbyon to confirm I've stopped production, to install monitoring devices so that we're all clear that I don't restart it. If he says something like that and starts a nuclear production freeze, we've got a much better future, a future which I think he will find much more peaceful, much more likely to lead to regime survival. And hopefully that's what he does. But it's very difficult to predict President Trump, and it's also very difficult to predict Chairman Kim.
So that's probably a very good note to end this on. The article that we've been talking through today is alternative paths to Korean unification. But I will link a number of other articles that Bruce has published below, because a lot of the research there we've been touching on as well as the previous podcast in which we both spoke about the issue of North Korean elites in any reunification. So on that, Bruce Bennett, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Happy to do so.